Hi, I'm Gregory Chin, professor at York University, a Roundtable blogger for the CIC, and China Research Chair at CG.
Thanks. So I wanted to start off by asking you about this notion of state capitalism that has been written about by Ian Bremmer and most recently in The Economist. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about what state capitalism means.
Well, I think what Bremer means is that the emerging economies have developed a model of capitalism in which the state or government has a much larger role than in the case of a private sector model as we've seen in the Western countries or the OECD or G7 countries. I think that's what Bremer means by it. In my own view, I think the concept actually can be somewhat misleading. I actually think it paints a bit of a binary and a bit of a false abstraction in the sense that it tries to talk about a very different form of economy in the BRICS countries than what we have in the West. And I think actually one of the most ironic things of the last 10 years is actually that there's been an increase in the role of the state or the public sector in economies around the world. It's not just a BRICS phenomena. In fact, if you look at the US economy and the British economies coming out of the global financial crisis, we know that their financial sectors were rocked by crises and continue to be, for example, in Europe. And we know that governments have been involved in bailouts around the world, especially in the advanced economies. And also, if you think about it even further back, coming out of the post-September 11 scenario, the tragedy of September 11, 2001, we know that there's also been an expansion of the role of the state in all realms of life, including in the United States, if you think about the growth of the homeland security concerns. And so this is not a phenomenon that is necessarily specific to the BRIC countries. There, in fact, has been a growing reach of the public sector around the world in economies. At the same time, yes, the BRICS, you could say that the government clearly has a certain role to play in many of these BRICS economies. For example, a lot of the state companies in the BRICS countries. And so therefore, there is something to look at, but it may not be as stark as Bremer's making it out to be.
The new FIPA agreement will likely increase Chinese investment in Canada. How can the Canadian government act to ensure that state capitalism doesn't encroach on our economy in a way that isn't of benefit to Canadians?
Obviously, this presents some new challenges and opportunities for us. And I think it would be beholden upon Canadians and the Canadian government at both the provincial and the federal levels and the local level to really think through both the opportunities and risks for Canada from increased Chinese investment. And that means really thinking through not only the opportunities, but the potential national security implications, right, of having foreign or international elements in our soil, in these areas where we've not traditionally had them there, and where there are connections to our national security. Part of this is the details in the Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreement yet. A lot of the details are still to be worked out. So part of this is kind of half hypothesizing how, what the actual impact. But I think we can be certain that the agreement as an important signal from government is part of the enabling environment to lifting our commercial investment ties with China, two-way, not just one way, not just China coming over, but also us going over to China. And I think, so then it's really important. This is where I think the commercial lawyers, the trade lawyers may have a bit of a field day, maybe even the government lawyers, right? Because they're going to be key in the next step as we work out the details of our foreign investment regulatory regime. We're going to have to adjust it. In many ways, it's outdated. My colleague Deborah Steger has talked about that from University of Ottawa. The need to rework and do our homework and to improve our foreign investment regulatory regime. And so these details will be part of the drilling down and the working out of the details to actualize this foreign investment agreement with the Chinese.
So, last question. Are you suggesting that Canadian regulation and the Canadian government should treat state-owned enterprises and their investments in Canada differently than in investments from multinationals? Or is it just merely that there's a shift in the type of investment generally, and so the Canadian Investment Act just needs updating?
Yeah, I think we need to develop some universal rules that apply generally to all companies and all foreign investors, not just China. At the same time, it's beholden on the part of government, in addition to those, what applies to everyone, to also have some sense of the particular challenges that are also presented or risks that come from investment from particular places, including the United States, right? And we know with the Keystone Pipeline scenario, there are risks involved for Canada to think through seriously, right? So I think we need to develop a kind of two-level strategy, right? A universal set of rules that apply to everyone, but also government has tools in which we can develop, some additional measures, which we would want to work out in consensus to some degree with the Chinese, right? So we have their buy-in and understanding. I think it's in everyone's interest, though, to move towards a scenario where the rules, the standards, the norms are more predictable, more transparent, where there's more certainty, where we remove the guesswork on what will or won't be approved for foreign investment from various countries. I think one of the great ironies in how Canadians have looked at the question of investment from China, right? If you remember, the Chinese company Min Metals at one point, right, 2005, was looking at buying Noranda. In the end, the Chinese did not receive approval to go ahead with that purchase. I believe an Indian multinational corporation ended up winning that. And then in another case, we know that with Brazil, they bought Inco, and now we have Vale Inco. The great irony is that there's often been a kind of concern about Chinese investment. But if you actually take a look at what happened in the labor situation in those two cases, they quickly went into situations of labor strife of the Indian and Brazilian purchases. And that is not to say that there is no risk in dealing with the Chinese companies, of course, right? When dealing with Chinese state companies, we need to know who we're dealing with. But at the same time, the Chinese state companies, I think, are very sensitive, especially with the Chinese government behind it, the Chinese Communist Party, very sensitive to criticism that China is acting in a bullying way internationally. And that, ironically, may in fact create a very different outcome at times than what we may anticipate. In fact, the Chinese may be more sensitive in some ways to keeping up a good image in Canada than even some of the companies from the other BRIC countries.